The loud, booming music filled one of the most exclusive pubs in the heart of New York City, Exotic. That night, the nightclub was packed with hundreds of people living as if there was no tomorrow. Laughter flowed freely, blending with the clinking of martini glasses, all mixed with the thumping rap beats that shook the floor. Strobe lights flickered wildly, blinding anyone who looked, creating an illusion as if time had stopped between the darkness and the light. The guests were people with luxurious lifestyles, familiar faces from television. Celebrities, entrepreneurs, and socialites who frequently appeared in world-famous magazines. They all gathered on the mezzanine of the second floor, a special area only accessible to select individuals, after passing through the tight security of large bodyguards guarding the stairs. On the second floor, life seemed different. The drinks were more expensive, the smiles were more fake, and the conversations were filled with pretense. Below, the dance floor was packed with people moving to the music, their bodies brushing against each other in wild excitement. Yet, behind the cheers and laughter, something was brewing in the darkness, something about to burst and shatter this night. Suddenly, a sound louder than the music broke the madness. A gunshot. Moments later, a man's body fell from the second-floor mezzanine, crashing onto the dance floor below. The cheerful atmosphere instantly turned to panic. People screamed hysterically, glasses dropped and shattered, and some took cover under tables while others rushed to the exit. The man lay there, soaked in blood, his eyes wide open, lifeless. The next gunshot echoed, this time louder from the second floor, as if warning anyone who dared to stay. The bodyguards quickly reacted, swiftly surrounding the important figures, protecting them from the chaotic crowd. A young woman fell to the floor, trampled as the pub-goers scrambled toward the exit. Screams filled the air, mixed with the smell of alcohol and fear. Among those being closely guarded was Daniel Winters, better known as Danny. With a cold gaze that seemed completely unfazed by what had just happened, Danny was flanked by two large bodyguards who quickly guided him out of Exotic. He managed to glance briefly at the lifeless man on the floor, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his lips. For Danny, this was just a small disruption in what should have been a pleasant evening. Danny Winters, 21 years old, was a student at an elite college in New York, and the only son of Donald Winters, a highly influential businessman in America and the world. Exotic, the pub where this tragedy took place, was his, one of the many luxury properties he owned in the city. Nothing happened at Exotic without his knowledge, and tonight was no exception. As the bodyguards parted the crowd, leading Danny toward one of the safe back doors, a line of luxury cars waited outside. Sirens began to sound in the distance. The police were on their way, but Danny knew it meant nothing to him. He was Danny Winters, and nights like this were just part of his powerful life. As the car door opened and Danny got inside, he noticed one terrified face in the crowd. His eyes locked with a girl standing frozen, her face pale. He recognized her, Emily, the girl who once rejected him. That fearful look made Danny smile wider. He knew tonight was just the beginning of what was to come. Everyone who dared reject or challenge Danny Winters would eventually get what they deserved. The car door slammed shut, isolating Danny from the chaos still raging outside. The car sped off, cutting through the noisy crowd, filled with police lights and screams. Danny leaned back, gazing out the window with a faint smile. In his mind, tonight would not stop him. Instead, it was just a reminder to everyone that power and money could always buy fear, even in the most glamorous lives. As Danny gazed at the bright lights of New York City from the window of his speeding limousine, a sense of satisfaction filled him. His heart was pleased after exacting his revenge on Emily, the girl who had rejected him multiple times. Emily had chosen Juan, a Mexican immigrant and fellow college student, over dating him. Danny was not used to rejection. It was something that simply did not exist in his life. To Danny, rejection wasn't acceptable. It was an insult, a challenge that had to be crushed. Using his cunning, Danny instructed one of his subordinates to lure Juan to Exotic, one of his nightclubs. Everything was arranged. The security guards had been given orders to create a small disturbance, just enough to make Juan appear to be the cause of the problem. As the situation escalated, Danny watched from a distance on the second floor, smiling as the drama he had orchestrated unfolded perfectly. Juan was eventually taken to the second floor, where he would never leave alive. Claiming that Juan would cause more trouble, Danny coldly ordered one of his bodyguards to eliminate him. A shot was fired, and Juan fell, while Danny, hidden behind a one-way glass, enjoyed every second of the destruction of the man who dared to take Emily's attention from him. This wasn't the first time Danny had used such methods. He felt powerful every time he successfully got rid of anyone who stood in his way. His previous crimes had proven just how ruthless and dangerous he could be. A few months earlier, there had been a young professor at his college, Dr. Peter Collins, who dared to refuse Danny's request to adjust his grades. Danny rarely attended class, often choosing to spend his time traveling abroad instead of doing assignments or taking exams. When Danny offered Dr. Collins a large sum of money to fix his final grade, the professor firmly declined, saying he wasn't the kind of person who could be bought. A very wrong decision. A few weeks later, Dr. Collins' life took a drastic turn. A video accusing him of harassing a female student suddenly surfaced on social media. All the evidence seemed real, even though the video had been fabricated by people Danny had hired. Dr. Collins couldn't survive the scandal, and he was eventually fired from his job and lost his reputation. He left the city, his name ruined, while Danny, with a satisfied smile, continued his life without a hint of regret. Then there was the case of a young entrepreneur named Elliot Green, who had once turned down a business proposal from Danny's father. Elliot believed the deal was unethical and damaging to his reputation. When Danny heard about this from his father, he decided to teach Elliot a lesson. One night, as Elliot was driving his luxury car down a quiet road on the outskirts of the city, two large motorcycles with riders in black helmets chased him. They rammed the back of his car, causing him to lose control and crash. Though Elliot survived, he was left paralyzed, ruining his career and ending his business ambitions. Danny didn't just manipulate people or make them suffer. He truly enjoyed the power he had over life and death. He relished the fear in the eyes of those who knew how dangerous it was to cross him. Emily, though the latest victim of Danny's obsession, was not the first and probably wouldn't be the last. Danny knew that as long as his father controlled the system, he would remain untouchable. Anyone who tried to resist or stand in his way would eventually face devastating consequences, either themselves or those they loved. Looking out of his limousine window, Danny watched the city of New York pulsating and never sleeping. The towering buildings gleamed under the bright lights, as if they were bowing to him. To him, it was all just a game. People's lives, ambitions, and love were mere pawns in a larger game that he controlled. In his mind, nothing was more important than himself, and he would do whatever it took to ensure that no one stood in his way to power and pleasure. Lifting a glass of champagne handed to him by his bodyguard, Danny smiled with satisfaction. The world was full of weak people, and only those brave enough, those who would take what they wanted without hesitation, deserved to be at the top. The limousine carrying Danny turned into one of the most elite areas of New York, passing through massive iron gates that opened as the vehicle approached. A grand, castle-like mansion stood tall, surrounded by beautiful gardens filled with classical marble statues. In the driveway, a line of luxury cars was neatly parked. Red Ferraris, gold Lamborghinis, and gleaming black Rolls-Royces, all symbols of wealth gathered in one place. This was one of Danny's homes, though it was more fitting to call it a palace rather than just a house. That night, like most nights, the mansion was the center of a wild party, accessible only to the chosen few. Behind the thick walls of classic European design, every form of pleasure money could buy was unfolding without limits. From the outside, it seemed peaceful, but inside, another world existed, full of decadence, passion, and tightly held secrets. Danny stepped out of his limousine, wearing a designer suit with the top of his shirt casually unbuttoned, giving off a relaxed yet powerful vibe. He walked into the mansion, his footsteps echoing on the cold marble floor, intricately carved with elegant designs. The massive mahogany doors were opened by two large servants, and Danny entered the room, which had been transformed for that night's party. There was no pounding music like in the nightclubs. Instead, the soft sound of jazz filled the air, the smooth rhythm of the saxophone adding to the sensual atmosphere in the room. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the guests who were indulging in the night. On a small stage, a pair of striptease dancers moved slowly to the rhythm, their bodies twisting seductively, adding an erotic touch that was impossible to ignore. Danny walked further into the room, and all eyes turned to him. Everyone who saw him immediately paused what they were doing and stood up to greet him, as if a prince had just entered the room. There was a high-ranking official from Washington, his face already flushed from the alcohol, a Hollywood star recently nominated for an Oscar, and even a Middle Eastern oil heir lounging on a leather sofa, laughing as he watched the performance on stage. All of them were chosen guests, people who understood the unspoken rule that in Danny's presence they must show respect. Danny smiled faintly as he greeted his guests with hugs, kisses on the cheek, and a few flattering words. He knew they were all here for one reason. They needed something from him, and Danny enjoyed the power he had over them. Some of them might have wealth equal to his, but none had the courage and control that Danny did. Power wasn't just about money, it was about control. And Danny had proven time and time again that he knew how to get what he wanted from anyone. In the corner of the room, waiters with silver trays moved back and forth, carrying bottles of expensive drinks. The finest champagne from France, rare bourbon available in limited quantities, and imported vodka so strong that one sip left many overwhelmed. The drinks flowed freely, as if there was an unspoken promise that tonight was for those brave enough to leave all norms and responsibilities behind. Danny glanced toward a long table in the corner, where a discreet transaction was taking place, small packets of white powder exchanging hands, followed by satisfied nods. This was a party that not only offered physical pleasure, but also absolute freedom. The freedom to break boundaries without fear of consequences. Danny had full control here. Every guest knew that whatever happened in this mansion would stay here, guarded closely by his loyal bodyguards. A beautiful woman in a low-cut red dress approached him, placing her soft hand on his arm. "Danny, darling, I've been waiting," she whispered, her lips almost touching his ear. Danny responded with a crooked smile and a nod, but his eyes wandered to another corner of the room, where a middle-aged man stood awkwardly, clearly not enjoying the party. Danny recognized the man. It was Thomas Grayson, a government official who had recently made a public statement opposing a development project initiated by Danny's father. That statement caused the Winters family's stock value to drop, even if only briefly. Danny never forgot an insult, no matter how small. Tonight, Thomas had been invited not to have fun, but to witness what happens when you stand on the wrong side. Danny had something planned that would show how wrong it was to oppose the Winters family. As a waiter handed Danny a fresh glass of champagne, he smiled meaningfully at Thomas. He knew the man was out of his element, trapped in a world he neither understood nor controlled. Danny savored moments like these, when his opponents felt small, cornered in a room they didn't recognize. In his mind, tonight would be the beginning of Thomas's downfall. Just like so many others who had dared to challenge him. Danny took a sip of champagne, enjoying the bubbling sense of victory inside him. This party, this room, and everyone in it was under his control. Every smile, laugh, and sigh was a reflection of the power he wielded. And tonight, he planned to show that his control wasn't just real, it was absolute. In the midst of the glamorous party, Danny kept a close eye on Thomas Grayson. Thomas looked tense, which was understandable. He was known for his strong moral stance, and it was obvious that he felt out of place among the drunken celebrities and the sensual dancers on stage. Danny knew Thomas wasn't like his other guests, who were used to leaving their morals at the door as soon as they entered the mansion. Slowly, Danny walked toward Thomas, his smile perfectly crafted. In his hand was a glass of champagne, which he extended as their eyes met. "Ah, Mr. Grayson, it's a pleasure to see you here." Danny greeted him with a friendly tone that was false, with a coldness underneath. "I hope you're enjoying the evening." Thomas took the glass hesitantly, a small smile on his lips, but his eyes remained cautious. "Thank you for the invitation, Danny. I must admit, this isn't the kind of event I usually attend." Danny chuckled lightly. "Oh, of course. But I think we all need to forget our responsibilities once in a while, don't we?" With a subtle gesture, Danny called over a young woman who had been sitting nearby, then introduced her to Thomas. "This is Angelica. She has a great interest in political discussions. I think you two will get along well," Danny said. Angelica smiled broadly, approaching Thomas with another drink in her hand. She knew exactly what was expected of her. Danny didn't need to say a word. His unspoken orders were enough. Angelica's role was clear. Make Thomas feel comfortable, persuade him to drink more, and perhaps, if things went smoothly, lead him to one of the upstairs rooms. Every room in this mansion was equipped with hidden cameras, carefully placed to capture all the interesting moments between Danny's guests. Thomas glanced at Angelica, returning her smile politely, but maintaining his distance. He knew all too well the reputation of Danny and his father. He had heard whispers among his colleagues and other officials, how those who attended Danny's parties often found themselves entangled in embarrassing situations, and how private videos mysteriously surfaced if anyone dared to oppose the Winters family. It was a dirty tactic Danny's father used to gain control over officials and celebrities, and Thomas had no intention of becoming another pawn in their game. He gently declined Angelica's offer and turned back to Danny. "I appreciate your hospitality, Danny, but I think I should be going. I have a lot to take care of tomorrow morning." Danny's smile remained, but behind his gaze was a flicker of coldness. "Of course, Mr. Grayson, we're glad you could make it." But inside, Danny was already planning his next move. Thomas may have avoided the first trap, but Danny wasn't going to let him walk away that easily. Thomas hurried out of the mansion, moving down the long corridors lined with luxurious paintings and sculptures. Inside, the guests were still laughing, enjoying the night, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching him from every corner. Once outside, the night air felt fresher, but there was still a lingering unease, as if the tension from inside the mansion had followed him out. A black sedan waited for him outside, and the driver quickly stepped out to open the door. Thomas got in, feeling a momentary sense of relief in the comfort of the car. But just a few minutes after they drove out of the mansion gates, something went wrong. The sedan slowed down, and before Thomas could ask what was happening, he saw two other cars approaching from behind, cutting them off. The car door was yanked open, and two masked men appeared. Before Thomas could react, they dragged him out, covering his mouth with a cloth soaked in a strong-smelling substance. His head spun, consciousness fading, and the last thing he saw before everything went dark was the shimmering lights of the mansion growing smaller, as if the castle itself was mocking him. When Thomas awoke, he was no longer in the car. The room around him was cold and dimly lit, with only a small chandelier swaying gently overhead. The walls were concrete, the floor cold, and the air damp. His hands were tied behind a hard chair, and before him, a shadowy figure stepped closer. Danny stood there, still wearing his faint smile. But this time, it wasn't the fake smile of hospitality he had shown his guests. This was the smile of a predator who had just captured its prey. Danny's eyes gleamed with a disturbing light, the madness he usually hid behind the charm of a rich man's son, now fully visible. He felt a surge of exhilaration. This was the feeling he lived for, having someone completely under his control, powerless, unable to fight back. Danny stepped closer, staring at Thomas with such intensity as if the man before him was not an honorable official, but merely a toy in his hands. He casually placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, pressing down slightly, just to see the fear flicker in his eyes. "Welcome, Mr. Grayson. I hope you enjoyed the ride," Danny said, his voice dripping with cold satisfaction. In his mind, Danny knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when all control was his. He no longer cared about recordings or political traps. All he wanted now was to see Thomas suffer. Danny slowly walked around the room, unbuttoning his shirt one by one. The dim light from the swaying lamp cast eerie shadows across his face. With his chest now bare, he looked even more intimidating, every muscle in his body clearly defined. He moved closer to Thomas, who was bound tightly to the chair, his hands and feet secured, his mouth gagged with a filthy cloth, allowing only muffled groans to escape. Danny pulled a small folding knife from his pocket, slowly unfolding it while staring at Thomas with cold eyes. The metal gleamed in the dim light, and Thomas knew well that this wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol of the power now fully in Danny's hands. "You know what you've done to me and my father, Mr. Thomas?" Danny's voice was almost a whisper, dripping with a terrifying arrogance. He began to slice Thomas's shirt with the tip of the knife, cutting through the fabric piece by piece with deliberate slowness. Each time the sharp edge grazed Thomas's skin, he could only wince in pain, his body tensing. Thomas locked eyes with Danny, but behind his gaze, there was a fear he couldn't hide. Danny, on the other hand, took great pleasure in every reaction Thomas made. He leaned in close to Thomas's bare chest, a cold smile playing on his lips. "You know, Thomas, we Winters never let people like you walk away freely. Do you want to know what happens when you go up against the Winters family, Mr. People's Champion?" Danny whispered with a mocking tone, as if he were speaking to a child who knew nothing about how the real world worked. Danny crouched down, his eyes fixed on the helpless Thomas. The knife moved lower, slicing through Thomas's pants, the movement slow and deliberate, as if he wanted to show Thomas just how powerless he was. The sharp tip of the knife touched his skin, not deeply, but enough to cause pain and bring tears to Thomas's eyes. The knife danced across his body, from his face, neck, chest, all the way down to his groin. Now Thomas's face and body were smeared with blood. Painful groans escaped from his lips. The sound was loud enough to let Danny know that the man before him was in agony. Danny paused for a moment, tilting his head to listen more closely. He found a twisted satisfaction in the groans, a mix of fear, despair, and pain, all rolled into one. Danny felt a rush of adrenaline coursing through his body, electrifying every nerve. There was a strange joy in hearing someone cry out in desperation. Danny's expression shifted, his eyes glowing with an eerie light, and his smile widened, revealing a row of white teeth. He stood still for a moment, savoring the sound of Thomas's groans and whimpers. "Ah, that sound, Thomas. That's the sound of the suffering we endured because of your cheap ideals," he whispered, sliding the knife slowly along Thomas's blood-soaked chest. Each wound and cut Danny made was a reminder to Thomas that he was now nothing more than a toy in Danny's hands. Thomas could only sob, his body trembling. He knew there was nowhere to run, no one to hear him in this isolated place. He could feel warm blood trickling from the wounds Danny had inflicted. But more than that, he felt his dignity crumble. He, a respected official, was now at the mercy of a young man driven by a thirst for power. For Danny, this was more than revenge. It was the feeling of having total control, seeing someone who once dared oppose him now cower in fear and helplessness. Slowly, Danny stood up, staring at Thomas, who was tied to the chair, naked, his body drenched in cold sweat and fresh blood. Danny admired the sight like an artist gazing at his masterpiece. In the cold, silent room, Thomas's whimpers were music to Danny's ears, a sound that made him feel alive. "That's how it should be," Danny muttered, as if talking to himself. "That's how everyone who dares to defy the Winters family should end up." He gently touched Thomas's face, as if offering a sympathetic gesture, but there was no compassion in his eyes, only pure enjoyment of the suffering he had caused. Suddenly, Danny plunged the knife into Thomas's neck. Blood gushed out, and Thomas's life slowly slipped away. Danny smiled, then laughed in satisfaction. He pulled the knife from Thomas's lifeless body. This was a side of Danny that few knew, a side that had grown stronger as he became accustomed to taking lives and crushing others for his own pleasure. As usual, Danny's bodyguards were prepared for the cleanup process. They knew exactly what to do every time Danny finished one of his games. They would erase all traces, remove evidence, and ensure nothing could link Danny to the crime directly. But that night, something was different, something that couldn't just be erased. Danny sped through the streets of New York City in his luxury car, adrenaline still rushing through his veins. The sunroof was open, letting the cold night air whip across his face. The satisfaction and thrill from silencing Thomas forever was like an intoxicating poison coursing through his blood. His fingers drummed on the steering wheel, matching the beat of the P. Diddy rap blasting from the car's stereo. Danny felt on top of the world, as though nothing could stand in his way. But in the midst of his blinding euphoria, Danny lost focus. He didn't notice the middle-aged woman crossing the street ahead of him. In a split second, his car hit her at full speed, sending her body flying forward. For a moment, Danny's world stopped. The sound of the impact reverberated through him. He slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a halt, but only for a few seconds. The woman lay motionless in the middle of the street. A chilling silence filled the air, broken only by the steady beat of the rap music still playing. Danny stared at her body on the ground. Instead of stopping to help, a strange emotion took over him. Not guilt, not pity, but anger. He was furious that this situation had disrupted his night, spoiling what should have been a moment of pure satisfaction. Without thinking twice, Danny pressed down on the gas, and in an instant, his car rolled over the woman's body. The car sped off, leaving her lying in the darkness, accompanied by the fading roar of the engine. Danny chuckled to himself, trying to calm down, confident that, as always, his bodyguards would take care of the situation. To him, it was just a minor accident in the middle of a long night, something that could easily be fixed with money and connections, as it always had been. But what Danny didn't know was that everything had changed. In the dark corner of the street, someone had witnessed everything. A young man, with only his phone in hand, had recorded the entire incident. He stood frozen, shocked by what he had seen, but his finger continued pressing the record button. The phone's camera captured it all, the woman's body being thrown through the air, Danny's face clearly visible through the open sunroof, and the moment when Danny mercilessly accelerated, running over the helpless woman. The video spread quickly. Within hours, the footage had gone viral online. People who had only heard rumors about Danny and his family's cruelty could now see it with their own eyes. The face of a young man devoid of mercy, brazenly taking a life and then fleeing the scene. Danny's face was everywhere, on phones, computers, and televisions, accompanied by a chilling headline: "Billionaire's son kills and flees." People who had long been fed up with the Winters family and irritated by Danny's arrogance finally found their moment. Social media was flooded with hashtags like "Justice for Victim," "Danny Winters must pay," and "No one above the law." In an instant, Danny's face became a symbol of the injustice that had always been felt but was now visible for all to see. The police, who had previously turned a blind eye due to pressure from Danny's father, could no longer pretend. The public outcry was relentless, not just from ordinary citizens, but also from major media outlets, politicians who were enemies of the Winters family, and human rights activists. They all united in a wave of anger, demanding one thing: justice. People who had been victims of the Winters family began to speak out. Former business partners who had been framed, celebrities who had been blackmailed with secret videos, and officials who had been forced to bow. All of them started to raise their voices. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The chance to see Danny Winters finally face the consequences of all his wrongdoings. Danny, however, was unaware that in just one night, everything he had once prided himself on, his power, wealth, and total control over others, was beginning to crumble. He didn't realize that during that high-speed drive, he hadn't just run over a woman. He had also destroyed the shield of immunity that had always protected him. For the first time in his life, Danny was facing the reality that he was no longer untouchable. Acting as if he had done nothing wrong, Danny stepped into the glass-paneled, gold-trimmed elevator that took him to the top floor of the most luxurious apartment building in New York City. The city lights still sparkled in the distance, while outside, the dawn was beginning to peak, casting a faint orange hue across the sky. The elevator glided up smoothly, reflecting Danny's calm face, with not a trace of worry. To him, everything that had happened tonight was just another part of his life, a life he believed was under his complete control. The elevator doors opened, and Danny entered his lavish penthouse. This was his domain, a place where he felt most powerful, protected from all the threats of the outside world. He tossed his car keys onto the marble table in front of the sofa and casually sank into the plush cushions. The scent of the fine leather provided a sensation of comfort, as if wrapping his entire body in a blanket of security. Danny smiled slightly, closing his eyes for a moment, letting his mind wander back to the events of the night. Thomas Grayson, the woman on the street, they all spun around in his thoughts. There was no regret weighing on him, no guilt haunting his mind. Instead, he felt a strange pleasure. Behind his closed eyes, Danny could still feel the rush of adrenaline, the sensation of having absolute control over life and death. This was no longer about money or political power, but a deeper, darker satisfaction. He smiled cynically as he noticed the splatter of Thomas's blood staining his jeans, a reminder of what he had done, proof that not only did he have control, but he also had the power to destroy. Slowly, Danny stood from the sofa, intending to head to the bathroom to clean himself up. He had just taken a step when a loud knock echoed through the penthouse. The knock was firm, urgent, and unlike anything he was used to hearing in his private sanctuary. It wasn't the polite knock of a guest or the sound of a servant at the door. There was something off, something that didn't fit with the rules he had set in place here. Danny's face tightened for a moment, his eyebrows furrowing. Who would dare come without notice? He grabbed the remote from the table to open the door, assuming it might be one of his bodyguards with an urgent request. But his smile quickly faded as the door opened, and unfamiliar faces began to pour into the penthouse. In an instant, the once silent room was filled with the presence of a group of police officers and detectives, their dark uniforms crowding the living room. The bright lights of the penthouse reflected off their badges and the weapons hanging at their sides. "Danny Winters, you are under arrest for a hit and run," one of the detectives said loudly and firmly. Several officers immediately spread out, inspecting every corner of the room to ensure there were no threats. Their serious faces contrasted sharply with the once relaxed atmosphere of the luxurious penthouse. Danny could only stand frozen in shock. The satisfaction and pleasure that had filled him moments ago vanished, replaced by a creeping disbelief that spread through his entire body. He tried to comprehend what was happening, but it felt like a nightmare. His blue eyes widened and his mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. "You have the right to remain silent," continued the officer, his voice steady and emotionless. as if he had arrested people like Danny many times before. Anything you say can and will be used as evidence in court. Danny struggled to control his breathing, his mind racing for a way out. No one had ever dared to touch him. He was Danny Winters, son of Donald Winters, a man not only powerful but connected at every level of government. How could these police officers dare to enter his penthouse without warning? Suddenly, he remembered the woman he had hit. How could anyone know? He was sure there had been no one around when it happened. Anger started to fill his chest, but this time, the anger wasn't directed at his victims. It was aimed at the world that now seemed to be turning against him. Who had recorded him? How could this happen? The police moved swiftly, pulling Danny's hands behind his back and cuffing him. The cold metal gripped his wrists tightly, a sensation completely foreign to him. For the first time, he felt fear creeping into his chest. He tried to reassure himself, thinking about his lawyer and his father, who could surely get him out of this. But somehow, tonight felt different. There was something in the eyes of the officers, something that made him realize that maybe, for the first time, his money and power wouldn't be enough. As the police let him out, people who usually minded their own business now stood in the hallway, some with phones in hand, recording. Camera flashes hit his face, and whispers started to rise around him. No longer did he see looks of admiration or respect. What remained were expressions of disdain and hatred, so clear, so palpable, as if judging him before the trial even began. Danny lifted his head, trying to maintain his cold, arrogant expression, but inside, he began to feel something he had never imagined before. Fear, a deep fear, the fear of losing everything. As he was pushed into the back of the police car, the red and blue lights flashed, casting shadows over his now pale, empty face. For the first time in his life, Danny realized that he might no longer be in control. The thrill and satisfaction he had felt just minutes ago now seemed distant, no longer relevant in the face of the legal noose tightening around him. The case against Danny quickly gained momentum, reverberating through both the real world and online. Within days, his name became a headline in every media outlet, from printed newspapers to breaking news alerts on smartphones. His face was plastered everywhere, on screens, on social media, and even on protest banners carried through the streets. The demand for justice echoed from the heart of New York City to every corner of America. Thousands of voices filled the streets, from Times Square in New York to Hollywood Boulevard in California, even reaching small towns in Michigan and other states. This was no longer just about a hit and run. It had become a symbol of long-standing injustice, and now the public was demanding retribution. After the police and detectives searched several of Danny's properties, shocking and disgusting discoveries began to surface. They found secret video recordings, obscene footage taken in his mansion, penthouse, yacht, and even on his private island. Hidden cameras were installed in nearly every corner, bedrooms, living rooms, and even private party locations. These videos didn't just capture inappropriate actions by Danny and his guests, but also documented high-profile figures, former presidents and their families, members of royalty, famous celebrities, and political figures who had attended Danny's wild parties. Somehow this evidence leaked to the public. Perhaps it came from an informant involved in the investigation, or someone in the underground network eager to see the Winters family fall. No one knew for sure, but one thing was certain. The world now knew what had been happening behind the luxurious walls that had always protected Danny. Footage of the parties, the guest list, and even secret conversations recorded by the hidden cameras were now spreading across the internet, going viral at an unstoppable pace. The media flooded the news with reports about Danny, his father, and the guests involved. Every video, every piece of evidence, fueled the growing public outrage. The stars involved began to disappear from the spotlight, one by one. Celebrities who had once been seen with Danny suddenly shut down their social media accounts, while politicians mentioned in the guest lists quickly withdrew from the public eye. Officials who had protected the Winters family could no longer deny their involvement, and one by one, they lost their positions, resigned, or were dismissed in shame. The Winters name became a symbol of disgrace, cruelty, and crime in the eyes of the public, and no one wanted to be dragged down with them in this scandal. With immense public pressure, Danny and his father, Donald, were eventually brought to trial and then imprisoned. Danny, who had lived a life of luxury, now found himself surrounded by the cold concrete walls and hard beds of a prison cell. His father, once so powerful, was now just an old man, cornered and stripped of the influence he had once prided himself on. Their wealth no longer mattered, and their connections could no longer save them. Danny's life, once filled with parties and extravagance, had turned into suffocating loneliness. One by one, those he had considered friends began to distance themselves. The celebrities who once mingled with him were now nothing but shadows of the past. The officials who had bowed to his father's power no longer answered calls, no longer offered help. All that remained was silence, a silence that underscored how everything Danny had built, the control and power he had thought were unshakable, had crumbled in an instant. In his narrow prison cell, Danny sat, staring at the blank wall. His face no longer showed a smug grin or the unshakable confidence it once had, but behind his eyes, something still burned, an intense, deep anger. He had never imagined that this could happen to him. How could it? He was Danny Winters, the man who always got what he wanted, the man who was always on top. This world, this system, was supposed to be under his control, but now he was trapped behind bars, abandoned, judged, and despised. In the suffocating silence of the prison, Danny seethed at the situation he found himself in. That anger boiled within him, simmering quietly. But beyond the anger, something else began to form in his mind, a plan. He wasn't going to let the world think he had lost, wasn't going to let himself be trapped in this cell forever. He was Danny Winters, and he always had a way out. A small, thin smile crept across his face. His blue eyes narrowed, and his mind began piecing together various possibilities. Who could he contact? Who still owed him favors? Who might be saved with the right offer? There were still ways. There were still people out there who, despite their fear, could be squeezed. There was still a way out. It was just a matter of waiting for the right moment. In the eerie silence, Danny muttered to himself, his voice low and full of determination. This isn't over. But the big question hanging in the air, something only Danny himself knew, was, what would Danny's next move be?